So hi everybody, I am Steve Call, and I'm the Dean of the Journalism School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you formally to this Alumni Awards Luncheon. We're here to enjoy each other's company, but also to celebrate 4 outstanding journalists who are graduates of our school: Elisabeth Bumiller, Elsa Chang, Marty Gottlieb, and Mariana Atencio. Congratulations to all of you. Welcome back to your school. We'll hear more about each winner a little bit later. I'd also like to recognize my predecessor, former journalism school dean Tom Goldstein, who's here someplace. Where are you, Tom? Yeah. Class of '69. Welcome back. You know, these are obviously unusual times for our profession, and it's been a difficult year in some respects. Attacks on journalists, such as those at the Annapolis Capitol and the failed bombing attempt of CNN last year. And I know many of you spend more time thinking about security and safety in your newsrooms than you did 4 or 5 years ago. But I'm sure you have an experience similar to mine, which is that all this attacking of the press has actually also strengthened us a great deal. It certainly clarified our role, our constitutional role, our public role. And it doesn't take much to see how deeply resilient journalism is. The Pulitzer Prizes will be handed out here in a few weeks, and if you look at the winners and read them, it's just extraordinary what a year it was in journalism, and not just at the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, but the Advocate of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which overturned a Jim Crow era jury rule that allowed defendants to be convicted on divided verdicts through old-fashioned investigative and enterprise reporting. And the Sun Sentinel in Florida, with a much depleted newsroom, still did extraordinary work after Parkland. So it's a paradox that our profession is under different kinds of pressure: economic pressure, political pressure. We have political leaders all around the world, including our president, who continue to deride the press using rhetoric that some people cannot help but hear as incitement. And yet journalism also feels as if it's in a kind of renaissance. So here we are, and I hope we'll keep working at it. I want to, just because you're back at your school, tell you a little bit about some things we're doing differently that since you were here. Just a few notes about that. We keep growing, which is great, not in the number of students, but in the resources that we can provide them. You might have seen we got a gift, $10 million gift from Craig Newmark to establish a new center and professorship in journalism ethics and security. We're very pleased about that opportunity because the idea is to kind of modernize journalism ethics a little bit, to take account of propaganda, new technologies, dilemmas that didn't exist before technologies like facial recognition or drone photography arrived on the scene, and at the same time to strengthen our commitment to the core ethical principles that I'm sure were front and center of your own experience at the school. And Joan Connor, another predecessor of mine, who passed about a year ago, many of you would have remembered her fondly. She was a great counselor to me coming in, and in her estate she created a new visiting professorship that will also allow us to diversify our faculty and to keep moving ahead. On the curriculum front, the biggest change probably in the last couple of years, we've made investigative reporting mandatory, a 7-week course, public records, court records, FOIA, and so everyone who walks out the door is at least literate in these kinds of techniques. We invested $1 million in a new multimedia video studio on the 5th floor. If you have a chance to, I don't know whether it's open today, but it's quite a upgrade for us. We were a little bit behind on technology and also flexibility there, and it's going to be a great teaching environment. And I think the last thing I want to mention is this spring, or in a few weeks from now, the first cohort in our new degree program will graduate. This is a 3-semester MS in data journalism, computational journalism. And it's just 10 students this year, but the applications zoomed up after the first year. We're going to have 20 next year. And I think we don't really want to try to do more than a section of this course for now. We don't really have the the resources to support more than that, but the demand for it, I think, is growing. And it's been enormously rewarding to see the kinds of students who come in with backgrounds in economics or mathematics and just a strong desire to report. And I guess part of the theory is that in this world where algorithms are power, you need computational skills to look underneath the hood and figure out how power is being exercised. And so the intersection between math and journalism, which I think many of us tried to avoid over our careers, is coming at us. And it's exciting for us because we're in the middle of a great research university with, big computer science department, and it just has enormous potential. But in my office, and for those of us upstairs who try to think about the good of the school every day, our greatest priority remains creating access to the school for the most talented and diverse students that we can find. And through the past generosity of many alumni and many of you, we have been able to increase our scholarship resources and their impact. As a percentage of the cost of attendance, we keep making progress in what we can offer. But we all make scholarship our priority. When I came into this role, I didn't understand how central that was to the health of the school and to the access that we create to journalism through the people with financial need that we can enroll and to make it economically viable for them. And that's where I direct my own philanthropy to the school as well. So I just thank you for your involvement in this, and I also would like to announce that we're about 2 years out from finishing the fundraising campaign that we've been in for 5 years. We're doing very well overall, but we really want to make a big push as this campaign finishes on scholarship. So we're announcing a scholarship campaign for Columbia Journalism School, which will raise money for exceptional students with financial need. And I hope mobilizing alumni to support that is really critical. I think what I found in the graduate school fundraising world is that there are lots of people who will give to Columbia as a kind of proxy for the health of journalism, but it's really only alumni who feel emotionally engaged enough to support the next generation of students. So we really need your leadership and your support as we launch this campaign. So thank you. Thank you for everything. Thanks for being here today, and I'm looking forward to the celebration of these 4 extraordinary journalists. And now I'd like to introduce Karen Toulon, who's led our Alumni Association board for the past 3 years. She's an editor at Bloomberg. She's been super generous with her time, and she serves as the voice of alumni at commencement, countless receptions and conferences. She's just a real light at our school, and she's really made us think hard about diversity, who our students are, where they end up, what they need. She's been a great leader. Her service is finishing up, sadly, this year by rotation, but I just want to thank you for the leadership you've provided and for everything you've done for the school. So, Karen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Apparently I have a teeny voice, which is news to my husband. Good afternoon. We're so pleased as the Alumni Association Board to once again present the winners of this year's Alumni Awards. Thank you to all of our alumni friends, family for joining us today. This Alumni Weekend, we have about 540 alumni and their guests with us. Some of us have traveled from as far away as Argentina, Guatemala, Denmark, Israel, Bahrain, Japan, perhaps even New Jersey, as I have, and points in between. We are using our J-School skills around the world in newsrooms, classrooms, and boardrooms. Some of us are in public relations and in communications. Others of us tell our stories through film, photography, podcasts, art, music, and even books. We are doing everything everywhere because we were here. And so it should come as no surprise that year after year, so many of us want to come back to this campus to reconnect, perhaps to expand on some new skills and explore some new ideas. Please join me in thanking Alumni Board member Elena Bose, who has worked very hard all of this year with Alumni Relations staff Maria Newman and Emily Snyder as the Alumni Class Agent Liaison. Where is Elena? She helped lead the communications to get us all here and has shown real leadership on our board as well. And as Dean Call mentioned, this is my last year as board chair. I want to say thank you for the opportunity to give back a little to the school and to Alumni Network that has given so much to me. I've been proud to be one of the voices of the school, helping to amplify the values of this great institution. And while I will no longer be on the board, I'm happy to remain on the board and to continue support our efforts. I'm glad that I work for a news organization, Bloomberg, that appreciates the importance of investing time in the next generation of great journalists, and also therefore affords me the time to devote to some J School activities. This luncheon is really all about the winners, so let's get at it. There are 4 accomplished journalists who were chosen for this honor by the jury of past winners. They will be introduced by people that they chose. Geraldine Baum will introduce Elisabeth Bumiller. Professor Emerita Ann Cooper will introduce Elsa Chang. After that, Dean Paquet will introduce Marty Gottlieb. And lastly, our own Dean, Ernie Sotomayor, will introduce Mariana Atencio, our first decade winner. Again, thank you all for being here, and let's welcome Geraldine Baum.
Thank you. It's so nice to be back at school. In the Elisabeth Bumiller cinematic universe, the origin story takes place right here at Columbia University. Sally Quinn, the famous reporter from the Washington Post, turns up on campus in 1979 to find a reporter to cover parties for the style section of the Washington Post. A dean, then named Trump, no relation, recommends Bumiller. Elisabeth is the most talented reporter in the class of 1979. It wasn't because you'd thrown a big party at the beginning of the year. So Sally Quinn plucks Elisabeth out of anonymity, and the rest is history. But I want to go back to the prehistory, because long before Sally Quinn ever turned up in Morningside Heights, Washington Heights too, Elisabeth was already the Elisabeth Bumiller we are so proud of today. The committed, no-nonsense journalist, the writer who with an economy of words gets right to the heart of things, a child of the Midwest devoted to family and community, and a freaking domestic goddess. At Northwestern University, where we first met decades ago, you could always spot Elisabeth across campus. The redhead in a canary yellow parka, while the rest of us were wearing drab greens and grays. It was the 70s. In our last year, as we were putting out our final edition of the Daily Northwestern, most of us were partying, drinking and inhaling. Over in the corner, though, there was one reporter who was pounding away on a royal typewriter. Upright and intent, our Elisabeth was writing the lead of the paper about a protest over a hike in tuition that for undergraduates was going up a whopping $307 for an annual cost of $4,500 for tuition. Now, many people here saw The Fourth Estate on Showtime, with Elisabeth cast as the Captain Marvel of Washington journalism, and Dean Baquet over there as Bat Masterson. We see Elisabeth walking her dog before daybreak and making coffee in her pristine Bethesda kitchen. She arrives at the Washington Bureau office, done up with a flair unknown to the great and good who preceded her. And she stares intensely at screens of copy and says wise things like, "Okay, publish." Well, that was the very intensity she had 42 years ago as the editors of the Daily Northwestern ripped page after page from her typewriter. After college, which, by the way, Elisabeth did in 3 years, while the rest of us did it in 4 years, she had an internship at the Miami Herald. And again, she excelled, getting hired within 3 weeks to be a full-time reporter in a 2-person bureau in Naples, Florida. I ended up in the bureau on the opposite coast, living in an apartment above a garage. Elisabeth, on the other hand, found herself the most charming little cottage, the color of pink salmon, dripping with bougainvillea. And these bureau jobs could be really hellish, putting out a full broadsheet of news 6 days a week, covering everything, and taking all our own photographs, and racing to the bus every morning before 10 o'clock to get those little rolls of film to Miami for the paper for the next day. One Saturday, after a particularly brutal week, I decided to drive the 2 hours across the Tamiami Trail to have dinner with Elisabeth. I figured macaroni, a couple of bottles of wine, and a lot of complaining on my part. But oh no, there were placemats and wine glasses and a gourmet chicken dish with peas and fresh vegetables. She had a recipe written on a little recipe note card. The woman was 22 years old, and she already had a recipe box. But she was always ahead of the class, and she always pulled the rest of us along with her. In fact, for a generation of women, and I suppose some men, but who cares, right? Elisabeth redefined the term trailing spouse. By 1985, Steve and Elisabeth were married and heading to India, where he had been named the New Delhi bureau chief for the New York Times. Those were the days when wives just dropped everything and went along with their husbands. In fact, former New York Times executive editor Abe Rosenthal had declared that Elisabeth could not possibly be allowed to compete head-on with her husband by writing for the Washington Post in India. Abe suggested that maybe Elisabeth could quit her job at the Post and work for the New York Times, maybe. By then, she was a major star, filigreeing members of the Reagan cabinet one by one. I have no idea what filigreeing means, but I read it in her recipe box. I will spare you the ugly details, but dear Abe had no idea who he was up against. Let's just say Elisabeth triumphed. And in that triumph, she blazed a path for every woman journalist of her generation and after. I'll never forget their going away party. Ben Bradley and Sally Quinn had it in their Georgetown townhouse. Now, I was just up from Florida, and it's what we'd call down there a double wide. They had fireplaces as tall as I am and a winding staircase. That night, the place was just packed with the Washington elite. I mean, I was the only person there I'd never heard of before. The toasts went on, a little like this one, and everyone was ready to get back to the bar when Ben Bradley suddenly realized he had overlooked the chair of the board of the Washington Post Company, who was sitting demurely, alone on an ottoman. "Catherine," he said, "would you like to say something?" Everybody leaned in, and Mrs. Graham said, in what seemed like a whisper, "Oh, I just want to thank Abe for allowing Elisabeth to write in India." And did she ever write? She wrote memorably for the Post on everything from wife burnings to stars in Bombay and intellectuals in Calcutta. Her book, May You Be the Mother of 100 Sons, is still considered a primer on women in India. And of course, stationed in Japan, she produced The Secrets of Mariko, another book that taught us about an important country through its women. Elisabeth did eventually come to the New York Times a decade later on her terms, and you all know the rest of the resume. Worldly wise, a writer's writer who became a gifted editor, Elisabeth has also managed to always create an amazing home and raise 2 wonderful children, to say nothing of a husband. At the Times, Elisabeth's experience, her remarkable talent, and a combination of determination and decency have brought her to the helm of one of the most important bureaus at one of the most freighted moments in American history. I can't imagine anyone better matched to this moment. It isn't just that Elisabeth never leaves a job unfinished. No job is ever done less than well. Her career and her devotion to family and friends aren't 2 separate things. Today, we honor her for her professional achievements, but they are of a piece with her life achievements, which day after day are marked by wanting to be the best and to share the best. And now, ladies and gentlemen and friends, Here is a woman who has spent a lifetime making things happen and making things better, my dear friend Elisabeth Bumiller.
Thank you, Geraldine. I think you know too much. I felt like this was my life. You know, I remember. Listen, it's an enormous honor to be recognized today by a school that has turned out so many superb journalists, including my fellow honorees and so many of you here today. In addition to Geraldine, who was in the class after me, followed me here after Florida, I just want to point out two of my bosses. There's a lot of New York Times people here, but Matt Purdy, who was with us in partner in crime with the Daily Northwestern, and of course my ultimate boss, Dean Baquet, who's here as well, so thank you. Geraldine, I'm going to talk briefly about the challenges of covering Washington in the age of Trump. But I want to say first what Columbia has meant to me. Geraldine, we didn't trade notes, so she took my story about Sally Quinn. But I do want to say that Columbia is directly responsible for my first job in Washington, although not in the way that anybody would expect here. I'll just fill out the story a little bit. And, when I first got here, I noticed that my classmates were very nervous and uptight, as I was. So I went with another student, Mary Voberl, to see Chris Trump, the assistant dean at the time, and we asked him if we could have a welcome party, and he gave us $300. And this is true, we had a party in the World Room. It was very, very successful. I was a good student here. I wasn't quite as good as Geraldine suggests. And so it's true, when Sally came up here looking for someone to cover parties in Washington, I was the name that they got because of that first party we had given. So what can I tell you? I went to Washington and I covered, White House state dinners, Capitol Hill fundraisers, book parties, art openings, and that was how I got my start. It really wasn't a bad way to start. But more important than anything, any job I got through Columbia, was what it gave me, which was something else. An education in gritty, big city journalism. I actually loved it here. And also the admonishment to sit down and think before I wrote anything. We weren't talking so much in those days about false equivalence, but Columbia taught me, or tried to teach me, I didn't always practice it, the limits of he said, she said journalism, and the great merits of finding the significance in a story, the larger meaning, what we call the nut graph, the truth. Decades later, that lesson is something I use every day. In covering the Trump administration, we don't define fair as giving equal time to facts we know to be false. We're more assertive now in our formulations. We often write, as Dean and Matt know, the president falsely said. On a handful of occasions in the news columns, most recently last week in our coverage of the Mueller report, with Dean approving, of course, we've written that the president lied. It's something we've never done before about a president, but it's something that these times have demanded of us. Thank you. Many of us here have gone into journalism out of a sense of mission, to hold power to account, to expose injustice, to uncover corruption. In the last 2.5 years, the Trump administration has brought that mission home to us. Yes, we're under attack as fake news in the failing New York Times, but the reality is that we're not failing, we're thriving. And not just us, but some of our biggest competitors. Yes, there's a crisis in local news reporting across the country, which we all need to address and help to fix. But in terms of investigative work and accountability reporting at the national level, in many ways, we're in a golden age of journalism. I'm very happy to get this award, but also humbled because it really does belong to the astonishing, brilliant, hardworking reporters and editors in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. Honestly, they just make me look good. They're the ones who broke the story after story on the Russia investigation, stories the White House repeatedly denied and which the Mueller report is now established as accurate and true. They're the ones who produced all the scoops on the dismantling of Obama's climate regulations. I could go on and on. They're the ones who write the lead-alls and the news analysis and the profiles and the takeaways, and they participate in the live chats and the daily and now the weekly, and I could go on and on. Journalism has changed drastically since I was here, but it's changed for the better. And so to them, to the reporters and editors in the Washington Bureau, and to Columbia, thank you for this great honor and for the education.
Thank you. Hi, I'm really excited to be here. I have a story to tell you. In the fall of 2007, 2 lawyers enrolled at Columbia Journalism School in the MS broadcast program. Both of them had degrees from top 10 law schools in the US. Both were incredibly smart, hardworking, really passionate advocates. One of them arrived here writing like a lawyer, dry and really wordy and just pretty boring. The other one was Elsa Chang. And I'm going to call her the natural, and it's been great to meet her parents today and realize that this wonderful storytelling talent that Elsa has been there since childhood, apparently. Anyway, when she started here, I think all of her professors were amazed at the, almost from the beginning, she was turning in stories that were deeply reported and elegantly written. And Elsa also has this wonderful knack of using a little bit of humor to grab our attention. So I want you to listen to how she starts this piece for radio workshop. This was a class 11 years ago, spring 2008. The story's about a program warning senior citizens that, hey, you may be old, but you can still get HIV. Take a listen.
The seniors at the Beth Abraham Center in Far Rockaway are making arts and crafts or playing bingo. Today, they're learning the proper way to slip on a condom. Teacher Betty DeBaptiste holds an oversized rubber model above her head.
You roll it down, okay? All the way down. They come and just...
So with the microphone in one hand and a coveted Kroc Fellowship in the other, Elsa graduated ready to dive into public radio. When she got there, she started honing some investigative skills and tackling stories on criminal justice. That led to a job at WNYC here in New York, and that in turn led to a DuPont Columbia Silver Baton for her terrific reporting on the city's stop and frisk policing policy. Now, for some people, a DuPont Columbia Award is the pinnacle of their career. But hey, this is Elsa Chang. She was only 4 years out of J school, really just getting started. In 2012, NPR hired her away from WNYC to cover Congress. Her tough reporting and her breezy storytelling style caught the ear of Planet Money. So she moved into the podcast world, but still was welcomed at NPR news magazines as a frequent fill-in host. Last year, Elsa moved from guest host to permanent anchor. She's one of 4 of them on NPR's All Things Considered. Depending on when you listen, she could be interviewing director Jordan Peele or singer Demi Lovato, or she might be out in the field reporting on politics in Arizona or exposing an asylum fraud scheme in Chinatown. So there's no short audio clip that I could find that would sum up Elsa's amazing journalism. So I'm going to offer you instead an audio sampling where I want you to listen to Elsa's voice, the voice in her writing, and also the voice in her fully engaged delivery.
Up until now, the biggest knock against Tim Kaine as a VP pick was that he's just kind of, well, boring. Susan Collins has broken both of her ankles. The left one was when she was sprinting in high heels because she so desperately refused to miss a vote. Collins broke her right ankle just weeks ago when she slipped on black ice. And now you'll find her gliding through the halls of Congress in a motorized scooter. What's the fastest this thing can go? You may not know this, but the U.S. Capitol is the most dog-friendly workplace you will ever find. Good boy. And come on, anyone who has to watch Congress all day needs a therapy dog.
Now, Elsa was uniquely qualified to write that last story, not because she covered Congress, but because her own dog, Mickey Chang, went with her to her Capitol Hill office every single day. I believe those are Mickey's barks in that audio clip. Let me close by coming back to the J School. It's spring 2008, the final week of classes. Fellow student Adam Hirsch catches an unscripted Elsa Chang expressing something that I think is probably going to resonate with all the alums in the room. Everyone who, like Elsa, has survived this tough and sometimes tortuous J School curriculum.
So Elsa Chang, what are you going to miss next Friday?
What am I, what?
What are you going to miss next Friday?
Sleep deprivation, bitterness at being overworked, bleary-eyed confusion over things that are very simple on regular sleep sufficient days to understand.
So Elsa's come a long way since those days of being bitter about overworked, bleary eyes, confused. Please join me and share my joy in honoring Elsa with this Alumni Award.
Wow, I've never been roasted with my radio work, but thank you, Anne. It is such an absolute honor to be here today, sitting with the giants in this room. When I first heard that I was chosen for this award, of course, all kinds of imposter syndrome feelings washed over me, and I just want to say how absolutely grateful I am to be here with all of you. As Anne mentioned, I stumbled my way into journalism a little bit by accident. I was a lawyer in a large law firm in San Francisco, completely miserable at the time, wondering what I had done wrong to land in a job that suited my personality so poorly. And about 5 years into it, as a litigator, I just quit cold. It was June 30th, 2006. I remember the exact day. I was 30 years old. And I had absolutely no idea, no clue what I was going to do next. So I spent several months just kind of bumming around San Francisco doing nothing, which got depressing and boring and frustrating. I found out that I'm the kind of person who doesn't like not having a place to go, who doesn't like not having people needing me to be somewhere. And so literally, just as a form of self-therapy, just to force myself to get out of my apartment every day and to interact with humans regularly, I signed up for an unpaid internship at KQED Public Radio in San Francisco. And I remember, like, my first day there, I was interning alongside college students, like 19, 20-year-olds, and they were looking at me like, what are you doing here? You're a lawyer? Why are you here answering the phones with us? And to be honest, they were not the only ones asking me that question. My parents, who are here with me today, were asking me the exact same thing. I was always the daughter who checked all the right boxes. I always had a plan. I always followed through. And for the first time in their lives, they saw me not having any idea what I was going to do with my life. And frankly, it terrified them. By the way, they're catching me on video and still camera as we're speaking. So while I was an intern at KQAD, I wrote the very first thing I have ever had on the radio, ever. It was an audio essay about my career transition, and I interviewed my parents for it. It was 2007, so as we're listening to all of my old work and embarrassing me, I'm gonna add this to the pile. I'm just gonna play you the first minute of that very first audio essay I did at KQED.
One day, my daughter told me, "Mom, I wanted to be Attorney General." So when she has a dream, I also have a dream with her.
That's my mother. She always got so excited when her kids dreamed. When I was younger, I really did want to be Attorney General, and sure enough, I became a lawyer. I was always convinced that I wanted to be a lawyer. I liked to write, I liked to argue, and the idea of being a lawyer really made my parents proud.
She said she wanted to go to law school. Finally going to Stanford Law School. I was really excited. This is it. Everybody said Stanford Law School is the door to all the future success, and my daughter is in there. So she got a law degree from Stanford Law School with high honor. That was the moment was really a great joy in my life. She got one of the first-class job in the law firm, one of the most prestigious law firm in San Francisco. I said, that's it. My daughter make it. I was really proud of my daughter. But then she make a U-turn.
Oh, yes, I did. And we fought so hard about that U-turn. I made a huge one. It was really confusing for my parents, but I have to say that the first moment my mom and dad really began to realize how excited I was, how determined I was to become a journalist, was when I stepped foot on campus here at Columbia. I mean, this place had, without question, a profound effect on me. I was an older student at the time. I was one of two lawyers, as Anne mentioned. I was 32, which at that point I thought was so old to be going back to school, and I didn't know how it was going to turn out. This place, I thought, I was in such a hurry to become a real journalist, and I thought if I enter Columbia and if I get a credential, that in my lawyer brain, that will make me into a real journalist. But this place gave me something far more important than any credential. What Columbia gave me were the first people in my life who read my writing, listened to the way my brain worked, and told me that I was made of something worthwhile, that I had a real shot at becoming a journalist, that I could do this radical thing in my brain at the time. And I don't know if any of you out there have ever tried anything completely brand new in life, but when you are in those very early days of doing something totally new, it's those small first words of encouragement that are just absolutely beyond measure. That is what you gave me, Ann Cooper. That is what you and John Dingus and Joe Cutbirth and so many other people in this school gave me. And I will forever be grateful to all of you and to this school for instilling those feelings of hope in me so early on. And what I have learned in the several years since I have graduated from Columbia is there really isn't a whole lot of difference between practicing law and becoming a journalist. And I mean that in the best sense. In both professions, truth is constantly interrogated. In both professions, truth is best ferreted out when you give conflicting viewpoints a full and fair hearing. You are a better journalist when you can understand all the sides of a story, just as you are a better lawyer. And I've moved, as Anne mentioned, from beat to beat, from criminal justice to politics to economics, and the principles are always the same. You need to be able to spot the logical inconsistencies in people's arguments, just as lawyers do. You need to be able to anticipate counter-arguments. You need to be able to make really complicated ideas accessible and compelling and conversational for people. So I just want to say, especially to my mom and dad, I really did not veer that far from law, after all, and I do know that both of you are very proud of me now, so thank you, and thank you to this school for helping a young lawyer believe in herself just a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no audio of Marty, by the way. At a time when local news is so much under threat, when we are asking who will cover our schools and who will uncover the abuses of power and the ravages of poverty in our big cities, it is so great to be honoring one of the greatest of all-time big city reporters. Marty showed up at Columbia 50 years ago. He had become a legend at Queens College for sending 2 reporters to cover the Vietnam War. He was a son of working-class New York who saw going to the Ivy League school as the thrill of his lifetime. In the decades since, he has worked at least once for most of the news organizations in New York City. They only gave me 4 minutes, and if I tried to list all of them, that would pretty much take up all of the time. But let's put it this way. If you pulled all of his work together in a book, which someone should, you would literally have a history of modern New York City. Its characters would include Donald Trump, who inexplicably asked Marty for advice on whether to hire Doug Flutie for his football team. It would include the Macklows and other titans who shaped the city, and every modern mayor. For the Daily News, Marty spent months in Bushwick to tell the story of the neighborhood hardest hit by the 1977 blackout. For the Times, he told the story of Al Sharpton at a time when the Reverend was a lightning rod for anger and powerlessness in the city. At the Village Voice, he edited the great Wayne Barrett and Bill Bastone as they dug into the city's corruption. And of course, Marty was the editor when the Bergen Record exposed Bridgegate, and when Newsday laid out the connections between the mob and business in Long Island. He is what is often said to be missing in journalism today, a big-hearted idea machine who cares about the city and all cities. To hear him talk about stories and to tell stories is an absolute marvel. He is a mentor. Heidi Evans, in her nominating letter, described his contagious passion. On that note, allow me to say something personal. He is not only one of the finest newsmen I've ever met, he took me under his wing as a young man new to New York, taught me the ways of the city and the times. He was generous, uncompetitive, and truly decent, and he deserves this award as a journalist and as a human being.
Well, I hardly know what to say. Dean has a way of doing this to me. And so do many of the people in this room. It means a lot to me to be honored in this way. I've roamed around, as Dean says, for a long time in journalism. I've made a lot of friends, and I'm so honored that so many of them are here today. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the great thing about journalism and newspaper journalism is that it's communal. And no one person does anything, and a lot of people do everything. And a lot of those people are here today. My family's here today. People I didn't know were going to be here are here today. And it takes my breath away. It actually reminds me of something that Ralph Blumenthal, one of my wonderful colleagues from the Times, said when I was in the culture department and we threw him a going away party because he was becoming the Houston bureau chief. And he had a crowd in front of him that's similar to the people I have here today who know me. And he heard a wonderful speech or two, although none more humbling or wonderful than that. And he came up with a wise comment, which I've always held on to. And it's, now I don't have to go to my funeral. It's an honor to be the fifth person from my class to receive this award and to be receiving it on the 50th anniversary of our time at Columbia. And it's wonderful to be in the company of Elisabeth and Elsa and Mariana. I go back in time. 6 months before our class started at Columbia, Martin Luther King was assassinated. 3 months later, Bobby Kennedy. That April, students took over a big chunk of the Columbia campus, and it shook the school to its core. And 2 weeks before we started came the havoc of the Chicago Democratic Convention. A few weeks after that, Nixon was elected president. And yet, our year at Columbia was just a great one. It was filled with optimism, purpose, and collegiality in the extreme. Much of that, of course, was because of the class itself and the selection committee that we all thought was great, and several of our teachers. Larry Pinkham was my favorite, and he caught the spirit of the times in an exhilarating course called Subjective Reality, which I know we all remember. Collegiality's continued for 50 years, and that has a lot to do with our formidable class leader, Ted Guest, who always believed in us. And he kept us connected. But there was another factor behind that wonderful year, and that was journalism. It's what drove us all together and what brought me together with the best colleagues and some of the best friends in my life, so many of whom are here today. All through the 60s, in the formative reading years of our class members, journalism was thundering in every direction. It was hard to miss. Early on, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. Walter Cronkite held the nation's hand after JFK's assassination. In Vietnam, David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, and other young reporters were challenging the Pentagon's strategies and body counts. In Washington, I.F. Stone found the fallacies of the war in documents nobody else was even looking at. Meanwhile, every newsstand and bookstore was filled with the offerings of the new journalists, Mailer, Steinem, Breslin, Tom Wolfe, and many, many more. It was enough to put a gleam in your eye. And I saw the gleam in the eyes of my J-School students like Heidi over the years, and three of the best of them are here today, Kate Zernicke and Beth Reinhardt, and Heidi, who nominated me for this award and pressed its case as if she were waging a political campaign. So if you're listening to me, the equation is no Heidi, no award. I saw the same gleaming energy in decades of colleagues who became like family to me as we pressed wherever we had to press to get the story, to make change, to bear witness, and simply to be there. Isn't that what journalism's about? So many of them I count as friends to this day. And rather than pontificating, I wanted to say thanks to all of you who are in attendance. To the members here of the Steakhouse clique from the golden days of the Daily News when Mike Oreskes, Marianne Giordano were ruling the streets. There's our great Metro editor, Sam Roberts, who is a mentor and a mensch to so many of us over the decades. And George James, a wonderful stylist who I've known since my record days, somebody who, we just moved and I came across a whole bunch of material. Somebody who described himself as an aging, self-deluded architect of word cathedrals who couldn't holler help in less than 2 takes. You could see that George has a future in this field. To Joe Lelyveld, whose presence here is a deep, deep honor. You were the North Star to so many of us at the times, and for me, the embodiment of everything that made the institution great. To many colleagues from the Times who were here for one reason or another, class reunions to honor other people who won awards and who, to a person, were just great people to work with. Above all, Dean, who, regardless of what he says about mentoring, taught me much, much more than I ever learned from him. Certainly about investigative reporting, but beyond that, about how to understand what a story is, how to stick with what you believe, and how to be generous in the most natural, in many ways, heartrending ways. There's the incredible assemblage of Bergen record luminaries who are here, brought together by its ferocious, fearless, incorruptible former owner, Mac Borg, and his wonderful daughter, Jennifer, one of the great press lawyers I've ever worked with. And my favorite one to boot. Now I know Maria told me there are about 200 people in the room today, so by my calculation, about 130 of you have worked at the record at one time or another. So I don't have to go into what made it one of the great regional papers in America and how, when I got there, it was a gift to work with a crew of editors and reporters who bled for that paper and who made it what it was, including the editors and reporters who broke the George Washington Bridge story, who are sitting right here, Sean Boberg and Dan Sforza. And they're great people. Go up and say hello. To Debbie Henley, who's the editor of Newsday, and which, under her leadership, and against all the tides that Dean detailed, it continues its strong commitment to local news and investigations, upholding the highest standards of journalism. She showed how a tabloid paper in one day could run a 30,000-word expose of local political corruption. And it wouldn't have happened not only without her, but without my true friend Alan Finder, who saw through the project, and without a great reporter, Sandra Petty, whose reporting informed that project, but sitting across from her, it's a wonder. I mean, her telephone is like a figurative barbershop for whistleblowers. Every day she's going over their lives, hearing what they have to say, and finding nuggets where no one even knew they were to me. Dearest of all, of course, is my family. My wife, Janet, who exulted in my successes often more than I did, and who brought me back to earth on many occasions. Our wonderful sons, Graham and Ben, and the marvelous women they brought into our lives, Gabriella and Noemi. There's also one person who's a member of our class, Tom Goldstein, who was mentioned by Dean Call, who's an honorary uncle in our family. He was the journalism school dean at the time of 9/11, when we lived 2 blocks from Ground Zero. And he took us into 2 empty bedrooms in his Columbia apartment, where we stayed for more than 9 months, until we felt it was safe to go back downtown. It was an act of kindness I'll never forget, and of all the things that happened to me because of my wonderful connection to Columbia Journalism School, the best one of all. 50 years after graduation, I'm fortunate to look back on a blessed life that's led me to places I never thought I would go. For a lot of it, I have journalism to thank, my kind in particular. As Mary McCrory, who is one of the consummate political columnists of her age, once remarked, I have always felt a little sorry for people who didn't work for newspapers. Thank you.
I have the unenviable task of following those people, but here I am. On May 20th, 2009, the journalism school's graduating class gathered in the courtyard outside Pulitzer Hall to celebrate and say goodbye to classmates. And as I devoured some of those gourmet snacks from Columbia Catering, I was approached by a very excited Mariana Atencio. She was arm in arm with a smiling gentleman who, as he came close, I could see had a couple of tears in his eyes. "Ernest," she said, "this is my father." He extended a hand, wiped away a tear with the other, and said graciously, "Very nice to meet you, and I want to thank you." The only response I could muster was, "Thank you for sending her to us." Then came another tight abrazo from Mariana, and an even bigger smile on his face. A father's pride is not a small reward for a job well done, and in this case, it was only the first of the many prizes that Mariana Atencio would earn in her new career as a broadcast journalist. From that day, she would move from Columbia between the worlds of Spanish and English media at places like VEME, El Diario, La Prensa, Univision, Fusion, collaborations with ABC News, and finally to her new professional home where she is today, MSNBC and NBC News. She's no stranger to standing before crowds like this, as her work has earned her a Gracie Award, a Peabody, prizes from investigative reporters and editors, and national headlines, and there are many more to mention here, because I only have 20 minutes here. I bring up her father because of a very single story in a long, impressive portfolio of work that she has compiled. Investigations to arms dealing on the border, global breaking news in Latin America and many other continents, expert commentary during the political conventions where you thought she'd done it all her life. Because it accomplished what we teach here and what she does so very well, that is report, report, and report. The story was published 1 year ago, after she lost her father, Alvaro, to a medical condition that is treatable in many parts of the world, but was not at that time and isn't today in Caracas, Venezuela. Like so many that she does, the story was steeped in deep reporting and written well enough to appear anywhere in the world. What made her story especially good, though, is that it was at such a difficult time for Mariana and her family, and even without her or her family being in it, it so professionally captured the horrors of her homeland. It was the kind of story we all wish every graduate here and every journalist would be able to do. She's now plunged into the long-form narrative, and in just a few weeks, her book, Perfectly You, debuts with the story from her days as a Venezuelan student activist to her navigation through our very complex immigration maze, family's tragedy, and how she has found success in simply being herself. 10 years can be a long time, or it can be a fast stretch in which one reaches profound levels of achievement through hard work and dedication, and she has. Like so many of her colleagues from this great class of 2009 who have distinguished this school in the past decade, she's often made time to come back to Columbia to participate in conferences, meet and inspire our new students at orientation time to visit classes. That's not an easy thing to manage, actually, given that almost every week she's on the road someplace. And the last time she was here, she jumped on a red eye to fulfill a commitment to meet with our students. It wasn't a small thing. That, to us, has been our prize. Thank you, and congratulations on the first Decade Award, Mariana.
All right, I'm petite, so I asked my husband to provide a little stool for me. That's what husbands are for. Thank you so much, Dean Steve Cole. Thank you to the Alumni Association of the Columbia Journalism School. Thank you, Ernesto, for your heartfelt words, and to all the faculty, my classmates here, my friends, for the first Decade Award. Gracias. Ernie touched on it, but coming back to the school, I was thinking precisely that on graduation day. And I want to double down on that anecdote because I want to put in perspective how much this means to me and my family. Growing up, my parents and my mom, who's here from Venezuela, they placed a lot of value on our education, working so hard to give us every opportunity. And as a kid, I just wanted to excel to impress them. When I finally made it to Columbia University's journalism school, it was hard because all my classmates were so good. You know, it was a level of excellence I had never seen before. So when graduation rolled around, my dad was here and I knew he was beaming, but when they announced the awards, he was sitting next to me and he sort of, propped up in his chair, and I turned to him and I said, "Papi, relax, I didn't win anything." So that's why 10 years later, this award is so meaningful, because even though we lost him last year, I know he is propped up in the biggest chair in heaven, looking down on us today and smiling proudly. So with that, let me begin. Papi always used to say, you can't know where you're going unless you know where you come from. So my journalism school story began on May 27th, 2007, in the streets of my hometown of Caracas, Venezuela. It was the day the biggest, the oldest television station in the country would be pulled off the air by the increasingly authoritarian government of then-President Hugo Chavez. This was the equivalent of yanking CNN, ABC, or NBC off the air from one day to the next. And it led to a wave of student-led protests. As young people, I was a junior in college, we protested in the streets, arm in arm with our teachers. We organized sit-ins and rallies, and peaceful demonstrations often turned dangerous. Riot police abounded, and they often used tear gas on us. And it was in the fog of those days that I realized I wasn't going to be able to do the kind of journalism I dreamed of in my home country. I had to flee. Where would I go? I needed a springboard to freedom, to the United States, an academic platform. So every night I prayed that I would get accepted to Columbia University's journalism school. I knew it was a long shot. English is not my first language. I didn't have an American undergrad. I had no journalism experience. I was by no means of the imagination a candidate for a scholarship. But Columbia University took a chance on me. They had faith in my skills, in my potential, and they gave me an opportunity, and that in turn made me believe in myself. After we graduated, like for many of my classmates here, it was not easy. We were in the middle of a recession. As an international student, I didn't have a green card. Our industry was going through profound change. So it was 10 years of starting out in a newspaper, getting fired, marching my butt back here to the Career Services office and to Julie and Ernie, figuring out what I was gonna do, becoming almost undocumented, having to move to Miami, enroll back in school, start out in Spanish language, do digital investigations to finally get a chance to be a reporter and then anchor and make that rare transition from Spanish to English language media. Every step has been the makings of this career that has allowed me to be privileged enough to cover some of the most important events in this, my adopted country's history over the past 10 years. The presidencies of Barack Obama, now Donald Trump, Ferguson, the child separation crisis, marching with the migrant caravan. And through it all, I keep coming back to the understanding that it would have not been possible without every single one of you here in this room. Without my teachers, my colleagues, the editors who took a chance on what made me different, on this unique perspective, this view of the world that I brought to the table. And one day, 2 years ago, I was invited to give a TED Talk, and I sort of put all those ideas out there. It was called, What Makes You Special? And it has now been seen over 9 million times worldwide and translated in 8 languages. My view of the world allows me to report in a cross-cultural, cross-language way. When media outlets, when universities understand the importance of having all of these different views in a newsroom, in a place of work, it makes our job so much better because we are obligated to have a broader scope of a story. We are obligated to give the protagonists a voice that doesn't get lost in translation, but found in translation at its most sincere. That has now inspired me to author my forthcoming book, Perfectly You. It's not out yet, but I brought the first media galley that I got because this was born in the halls of this institution. Individually, we all have our perceptions, our backgrounds, our viewpoints that influence how we see the world. But Columbia University taught me that when we come together, it's easier to see nuance, accuracy, balance, and truth. So thank you, Columbia. Thank you to everyone here. Special thanks to my mom, Mami, who made it here, to my husband, who's live on Instagram. Mi amor, I couldn't do what I do without you. And Papi, I hope that I made you proud today. Thank you guys for teaching me that you don't have to be perfect to walk these halls and succeed. You just have to be perfectly you. Gracias.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes our program, but I just wanted to tell you how important it is that all of you are here to hear all of these individuals. I think if you are a graduate of the school or associated with this school, like many of us are, you understand how important these awards are. When young students walk into our hallways in August, essentially what we are saying to them is, may you one day be as great a journalist as Elisabeth, as Elsa, as Mariana, and as Marty Gottlieb. That's what this means to us. The greatness that they've shown and the success that they've shown. So it means a lot that you're here to help us celebrate them. So thank you for being here. Have a good afternoon.